Kalimera. Welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid A-Level Greeks. The sun's shining, we're all locked inside, I'm wearing a toga, and in this episode we're going to look at the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC. So previously on Stupid A-Level Greeks, we've seen the start of the Second Peloponnesian War, this return to hostilities between Athens and Sparta, particularly the Battle of Mantinea. As always, the Athenians found they were no match for Sparta in a pitched land battle, and renewed hostilities were certainly stretching the loyalty of the Athenian allies. The worse the Athenians did, the more the tributes kept increasing, and as always we've got detailed records of these. Fewer and fewer states in the now Athenian Empire we know sent the important things of ships or men. It's much easier for them to just pay the increasing cost, send money, rather than their sons or husbands. It's fair to say as well that by 418 the allies saw less and less benefit of being allied to Athens. The Persians had not been a threat for 50 years, and don't forget there is that line that the Ionians felt they'd swapped one tyrant for another. So, struggling to find a way to resolutely defeat Sparta and the Peloponnesians, the Athenians looked back to an old tactic. This is one they'd not used since the expansion in the 470s. The Athenians looked back to the rise of their power during the expansion of the Delian League. Whereas before this had triggered the start of the Athenian Golden Age, they hoped that this would bring around a resolution to this conflict with Sparta. A similar expansion would certainly bring in more allies, troops and money that the Athenians could now point in the direction of the Peloponnesians and hopefully bring about their defeat. The other thing that might benefit would be it would certainly give their existing allies, the Ionians, a break from these ever-increasing demands for tribute. By now the conflict had dragged on ultimately for the best part of the century. The Ionian states now in a position in the Athenian Empire where ethically they had more right to rebel against an oppressive ruler than if they were part of a collaborative league. The only problem the Athenians had then was where much of the Adriatic, the Ionians, the Sicilians and so on, had already committed themselves to one side or another. Last time they locked horns was over these neutral territories in the north and Thrace, but that was now out of bounds. It seemed like the majority of what you could think of as the localised Greek world was now signed up to either the Peloponnesian League or the Athenian Empire. So they had to look even further afield if they were to expand. Now handily, an opportunity for expansion arrives in 415, when emissaries from a city-state in Sicily, just south of Italy, arrive in Athens. So before we get into the more intricate details of the invasion of Sicily, it's worth doing some background. Although it may not seem like an obvious choice for expansion, Sicily presented the Athenians with a real opportunity. Sicily and the southern regions of Italy had been settled by Greek colonists as early as the 8th century BC. So while Romulus was hanging around suckling off a wolf, the Greeks were settling the south of the city. And we know this because a lot of the early histories of Rome are Greek. Certainly if you go to Sicily now, there are lots and lots of evidence of Greek settling there. A lot of the architecture is Greek. There are Greek theatres. They're certainly well established. Sicily as well is strategically important. It's a stepping stone across the Mediterranean between the Carthaginians in North Africa and Italy in Europe. It's massively strategically important for trade, for access from between east and west, and whoever controls Sicily effectively controls those narrow shipping lanes between Europe and Africa. Sicily would also make a handy base for anyone or certainly the Athenians, if they wanted to expand into Italy. As we've said before, by this time the Romans are still sorting out various secessions, decemvirates and wars of independence. They're in no shape to fend off an aggressive Greek force. It's worth pointing out as well that in the Second World War, when the Americans chose to launch their invasion of Italy, they did so for using Sicily as a launch base. The other point is many of the city-states in Sicily still hold some allegiance with the states they came from, these original Greek city-states. So while Athens can probably count on a good number of allied city-states within the region, they also could face some problems, and certainly the main power on the island at the time was Syracuse, who held allegiance to Corinth, where their people were originally from. Certainly previously it made sense for Syracuse to ally with Corinth in previous conflict or political arguments, so any attempt to weaken Syracuse would therefore weaken Corinth, and we all know how much the Athenians get on with Corinth, so this is obviously a massive, massive bonus. And to the origins of the expedition. So, in the spring of 415 BC, envoys come to Athens from the Sicilian city-state of Egesta or Egesta. Egesta had been allied to, but not part of the Athenian Empire, to Athens since 450 BC, and both Egesta and Athens shared a tripartite alliance with another smaller city-state in Sicily called Leontini. Now, both these city-states had previously come into conflict with Syracuse, that we've said previously was the major power in Sicily and a close ally of Corinth. And Athens had even intervened as a third party in this conflict in 427, so there is history of Athenians dealing with these city-states before. It's not a complete leap in the dark. So when the emissaries from Egesta turn up, the Athenian Senate are split, and as always with the Athenian Senate, they're split behind two key people. The first one, young, fiery, rich aristocrat Alcibiades, supports the expedition. He suggests to the Athenians the opposition are weak, they're disorganised, Sicily is vastly wealthy, and any expedition here could only be easily won, and all the benefits the Athenians could certainly bring back to face onto the Peloponnesians. As far as he's concerned, it's a done deal. On the other side, though, we see Nicias, the guy of the peace treaty, who thought this really was a bridge too far. It was stretching Athens too thin. He cited the fact that previously, in the last conflict, Athens had lost key trading ports and key city-states in Thrace, such as Amphipolis, and still not got them back. He took a more conservative and traditional idea, suggesting that the Athenians need to sort out their immediate problems before they charge off headlong into creating new allies or new territories that would effectively, as he puts it, make them seem weaker. Long story short, Alcibiades wins the argument, and the Athenian Senate start debating preparations for this expedition to Sicily. As a result of this debate, then, the Athenians begin preparing in earnest. Alcibiades had managed to convince the Athenians that he needed a force of 60 triremes, 60 warships, and 1,200 hoplites for the expedition, plus various light infantry and support troops and so on. Nicias does not take his defeat easily, and he hatches another plan. He has other ideas. He now returns to the Senate and argues that should the expedition go ahead, the force Alcibiades is suggesting is far too small to be successful. He argues that it would be disastrous and dangerous to send so few Athenian troops without the right support. He argues a much larger force is going to be needed if the Athenians are to succeed and limit their casualties. He doesn't necessarily believe this. His actual intention, we're led to believe, is that he wants to make the numbers suggested or the numbers needed so huge and the cost so vast that the Athenians would change their mind that no amount of treasure, plunder or glory was worth taking this risk. Effectively, Nicias aims to empty Athens of troops and ships, which in the middle of a war with a much closer ally in the Peloponnese is really quite dangerous. Plus you've got to pay everyone. Unfortunately for Nicias, old silver-tongued Alcibiades, with the help of the Egestans, convinces the Athenian Senate to back this much, much larger force. The Egestans say they will pay for everything and they have a vast amount of money to do so. Alcibiades backs this up, again reiterating how weak any opposition would be, and the Senate agree. As a result then, compared to his previous list of 60 ships and 1,200 hoplites, the Athenians amass a fleet of 160 ships and nearly 7,000 hoplites. This is obviously a massive, massive increase on the amount of troops and resources that Alcibiades initially wanted to commit to this expedition, and certainly far more than the Egestans could ever possibly hope to pay for. Because it's now such a vast venture, another commander is added to this leadership pot. The expedition to Athens is led by Alcibiades and Nicias between them, because they are the two who've been pushing for this apparently. But to act as a moderator between the two to create almost a mini triumvirate, a third guy is added, Lamachos. He's a veteran and he is there to kind of calm or bridge these two oppositional commanders in this really quite significant, really quite grand venture, the Athenian invasion of Sicily. Now, one curious aspect about this invasion of Sicily is, despite its origins being in the cry for help from a Sicilian city-state, the Athenians are sent with, for the time, definitely a very, very unusual, vague mission statement, a very vague mandate, and it comes in three parts. The first part of their mission is to help the Egestans against their local enemies, which is what they've been asked to do formally, so that's straightforward. The second one is to aid and re-establish their old ally, Leontini, which is on the other side of the island. Again, nothing new there. Athens have had contact and dealings with these people for quite some time. They are simply showing that they are re-supporting their allies regardless of where they are. The interesting bit is this third clause, or this third aspect to the mission, that whilst there, they should do anything else that would aid Athenian interests in Sicily, in that part of the world. So certainly people at the time and scholars since there, with the inclusion of this very, very vague and suspect third mission statement, this ultimately reads that whilst they are there, should the opportunity arise, that this force sent to help one of its allies effectively should either take Syracuse from the Corinthians or take the whole of Sicily. Whatever would aid Athenian interests in that region effectively is candid speak for conquest and invasion. So it seems even before the Athenians are able to set sail, this mission is marred in crisis. Before the expedition gets underway, there's an unusual act of religious vandalism that strikes Athens. So, across Athens, particularly at crossroads, it was really common at the time to see shrines called Hermes, to Hermes, the god of travellers. There's still examples of these. This was reassuring for travellers. It was a very, very common thing. So these Hermes were commonly marble plinths, like a rectangular marble block, with the bust of Hermes on top, and what's described as an ithyphallic ornament. Effectively, it's a statue of Hermes as a street sign with an erection. Because, what do you need on a street sign? Apparently an erection. So it's particularly these ithyphallic ornaments that start being systematically broken off of these Hermes right across the city. It's like the Vatican have turned up and started swapping penises for vine leaves again. Across the city, these Hermes are being emasculated. Their phallic ornaments are being broken off in the middle of the night. Now, apart from this being completely ridiculous, the Athenians see this as a really, really dire omen, particularly for anyone who was about to travel, maybe say to Sicily and back. So they take it very, very seriously, and the powers that be hold an investigation. They start investigating who's been chopping off wangs, who's been seen around on street corners. It's a big deal. And one of the main suspects seems to have been Alcibiades. Now this is not completely out of character. Alcibiades, as this kind of young aristocratic dilettante, has previously been associated with all manner of naughty behaviour before. He is this kind of playboy aristocrat who has been pleasure seeking for most of his life up until his employment in politics. And certainly it's likely that the only reason he's not being brought on charges before is because he did live as the kind of ward of Pericles, even though he's not related to him. So he's sheltered under Pericles' wing, certainly. So he is clearly number one suspect in this kind of religious defamation of these Herms. But because this Sicilian invasion is now so close to preparation and fruition, and it's such a big undertaking, he is allowed to set sail to Sicily while the investigation continues. Clearly this invasion is seen as far more important than the emasculating of a number of statues across Athens. And finally, by 415 BC, the Athenians sailed to Sicily without a serious incident. When they get there, however, they found not all is as it should be. The Egestans couldn't actually pay the Athenians. They couldn't actually pay for the original invasion force, never mind this new invasion force. And we're given some detail about how they managed this. Initially, when Athenian envoys were sent to Egesta to see whether they did seem like the kind of people who had the money for this invasion, they were taken round to each of the most important people's houses to dine. And obviously they pulled out all the gold and silver dinnerware, the cups and so on. And each night they dined in a separate person's house. They were taken around the town and made to feel very welcome. But what they didn't realise was that every night all the gold and silver and the dinnerware and the ornaments and all the elaborate ornamentation that these people had was simply being swapped from house to house. So it made the Egestans seem like a much wealthier city-state than they actually were. When they turned up, the Athenians started to worry how were they going to pay their troops. The other problem was that even the commanders, once they got there, couldn't agree on a plan of action. I mean, this is no surprise given what we know previously about the kind of very conservative, steady Nicias and the more rash, elaborate, headstrong Alcibiades. But saying that, the plans are not too drastic in themselves. Alcibiades wants to delay any attack until they gathered reinforcements from the local Sicilian towns. He is convinced that other towns in Sicily will join this Athenian expedition force, and ultimately they will end up taking Syracuse. This is his main aim. To deal with everything that happens, they have to deal with Syracuse. He's counting on enough hostility within Sicily and his own powers of persuasion to get this underway. Nicias, however, takes a more steady view. Once they're there, he really only wants to deal with the immediate problems in Egesta, because this is what they were paid for, although not paid enough, and this is what he sees the Athenians have resources for. So he wants to deal with Egesta, consolidate Athenian influence on that western side of the island. Whilst there, though, while he's got this huge Athenian fleet, he wants to effectively sail the Athenian fleet around the island, making sure everyone can see it, and this way he hopes to intimidate the Syracusans into not supporting the Peloponnesians, or maybe even swapping sides. Because, everyone's got precedent for this. It's not like people haven't swapped sides many times before, and there's no reason why Syracuse wouldn't. Lamachus, our third man, our Lepidus of this expedition, sides with Alcibiades, and preparations for the attack on Syracuse begin. Now, even before the planned attack on Syracuse can get underway, the expedition's marked by its second massive crisis. As the preparations are underway and things are starting to gather momentum, Alcibiades is summoned back to Athens for his supposed wang vandalism. The investigations into this desecration of the Herms has been going on, and they're pretty sure Alcibiades has some strong questions to answer. Now, whether or not he did it, and we have nothing in any source suggesting credibly whether he did or he didn't, such is the nature of backbiting in Athens, Alcibiades fears that any attempt to put him on trial or to make him answer questions about this heretic vandalism will be manipulated and used by his political rivals, of which there are more than a few, and he fears any sham trial that may be put forward, he will be instantly found guilty, he will suffer serious and dire consequences, and his enemies will use this as the opportunity to punish him quite severely, whether he was innocent or not. So, rather than facing trial that he believes is going to be unfair, on his way back to Greece he manages to slip away from his guards who are meant to bring him back, and eventually he finds, after what must be some serious smooth talking, or the fact that he's a key Athenian, he finds refuge and exile in Sparta, which is probably the last place in the world you'd expect to see a dilettante and a playboy like Alcibiades. But it also speaks to just how fearful he was of the ramifications of this potential court case that was coming up. Now, if that's not bad enough that the expedition has lost its architect, its main backer, Nicias' health is starting to fail him. And, truth be told, neither he or Lamachus are particularly keen on the plan they've been left with. This was, don't forget, Alcibiades' plan. It probably relied on himself convincing local Sicilians to join them and pushing things through. So as their newly grown forces are starting to get ready to attack Syracuse, by the time they've actually got a reasonable force, it becomes too late in the year. So they march across Sicily and they decide to spend the winter in a place called Catana, which is just north of Leontini and Syracuse. Now, this obviously gives the Syracusans time to prepare, send emissaries to the Peloponnesians, and it also gives the Athenian allies time to desert. So even in these opening gambits of this Sicilian campaign, we can see it's a bold stretch, but it's already hitting more barriers than Xerxes invading Greece. And so on to the analysis. Why is this a big deal? Why do we care so much? Why is this now having to become a two-part podcast? So, first thing we can point out is that Thucydides himself dedicates 2 whole books to the Sicilian expedition. This is all of Book 6 and all of Book 7. And he sees this as a central event in what he ultimately describes as Athens' greatest disaster. He's quite clear this is pivotal in bringing about the failure of Athens. He likens it to the plague in 428, which again he claims did more damage to Athenian powers than the Spartans did. And at the time, don't forget, they're just merrily invading Attica for 4 months in a year before going home. He also links it to the aggressive expansionism that he blames for the conflict. Don't forget, despite being Athenian, Thucydides firmly blames Athenian expansion as the underlying cause of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. And he sees this simply as an extension of this. He's clear from the beginning that this is a fool's errand. Thucydides is clearly much more of a fan of Pericles' cautious approach to any kind of conflict, not expanding but improving what Athens already had. And he talks about this in great detail in Book 2. He's clear that he thinks particularly Pericles' policy of building walls and fortifying and glorifying Athens and Athenian holdings at the time is far more sensible than charging off into the horizon across the wine dark sea to acquire new lands. Similarly, Thucydides suggests that Alcibiades, and Thucydides is not the only one who does this, Alcibiades is acting more in his own interests, particularly gaining even more personal wealth and all the booty and bounty from this expedition, but probably more importantly for a man at his point in his career, he's aristocratic, he's wealthy, he's making early splashes in politics. What he's missing really is military honours, and then he sees himself as being the full package, as Pericles was, as someone like Cimon was, even as much as Themistocles was. The Athenians have a soft spot for archons who've achieved great military honours. So certainly Thucydides seems to suggest that Alcibiades is pushing for this expedition more for his own aggrandisement than out of genuine Athenian interests. And again, he's not quite as brutal as he is about Cleon, but he makes this link between Cleon doing a similar thing, very similar to Cleon's expeditions into Pylos, Mytilene, and his failed attempt in Thrace. Again, to wave that Cleon is an idiot flag, similar to the Mytilene debate, where Cleon whipped the Senate into a frenzy. Thucydides is also now pointing out how, for the second time at least, the Senate has been persuaded into poor decisions by a smooth-talking charmer, if not a demagogue, by Alcibiades rather than Cleon. The methods and the tactics may be different, the men may be different, but ultimately the effect is the same, that the Athenian Senate, it's almost like he's suggesting they've lost their good judgment, that they're making bad decisions and are becoming easily led. Which you can see evidence for, but what we should point out is, certainly by this time, Thucydides is now in exile. He's certainly no friend of this modern Athenian government, and this could just be simply a case of Thucydides, logical as he is, starting to grind his axe against those who he sees have cast him off. So the next logical point of discussion has to be, was the Sicilian expedition an absolute mistake? Was it in fact the worst decision since Helen of Sparta decided to have a quiet drink with Paris? And obviously there's two sides to it. The obvious side is yes. Realistically, the Athenians set off without knowing what to expect. They were misinformed by Alcibiades, by the Egestans, about what to expect when they hit there. They didn't understand the nature of the Sicilian city-states, they overestimated their wealth, they certainly, as we'll see later, they certainly underestimated the resolve of some of these Sicilian city-states, and particularly that of Syracuse. This was a massive mistake, travelling a very long way on very limited information. The next point we'd look at is their desire to expand and grow and gain more allies. This had never really died down since the defeat of the Persians. This idea of expansion and Athens' time to rise had not gone away. They still thought, clearly by 415, that this was still the best course of action, even though effectively this had not been effective for over 50 years. Excuse me, not coronavirus, I promise. This had now worked successfully for a long while, and if anything, the more allies and the more subservient states they had, effectively the more problems they had, or they would have, when they start demanding more and more tribute. So you can argue the whole idea is flawed. The next thing we need to point out is that they've not learned from previous attempts. We know in the First Peloponnesian War, they again attempted a bold move. They attempted to expand, strike a blow far afield when they tried to expand during the invasion of Egypt. And this turned out, funnily enough, to be a complete disaster. The Athenian forces were too far from home. They lacked support, they lacked resources, they lacked local allies, and as a result they were turfed out of Egypt quite unceremoniously. The Sicilian expedition is very, very similar. It's much of the same, but more so. But what makes the Sicilian expedition even more problematic is the fact that they didn't have a clear plan when they set off, or cohesive leaders. They were there to take the island Or were they just there to help out a jester? No one seemed to have a clear idea. You can arguably see between Nicias and Alcibiades, they don't know what they want to do either. One wants one thing, one wants another. Neither has got clear mandate to decide what comes next. However, we can't just write the Sicilian expedition off as just a complete mistake. By this point in the proceedings, we know that Athens had little choice at the time. Athens was certainly starting to face a downward turn. The Peloponnesians were consolidating their hold in Greece. They'd recently reformed the Peloponnesian League following the Battle of Mantinea. Sparta's skill seemed to be on the rise. Their successes were ever increasing. They'd regained any lost ground after Pylos particularly. And the Athenians seem to be floundering. Their allies are grumbling. They've not had a significant military victory in a while, and their attempts to help other like-minded states like Argos have ended in disaster. We can also see that Athens can rely less and less on its allies at this time. Yes, they are sending money, but they are not sending ships and troops, these valuable resources that Athens desperately needs to tackle the still significant threat of the Peloponnesian leagues. So if Athens really are in a desperate situation, they have to do something to tackle Sparta. They cannot afford to just do nothing. So if you take the argument back to Thucydides of Pericles' steady lack of expedition, his conservative consolidation, that really isn't an option for Athens at this time. They are not as strong as they were in 458. They are not as strong as they were in 428. They are suffering. They need to do something. And arguably, had the Sicilian expedition worked even to some extent, even if we're not talking about taking the entirety of the island, with the growth of new colonies and new lands in Sicily, this absolutely will have reinvigorated Athens' ability to fight. As we've talked about, Sicily is seen as the gateway to Africa and Italy. This is a potential future route of Athenian expansionism, new sources of revenue, new sources of troops and raw materials. So this could potentially have turned the tide, at least in some way, against Sparta, had it worked out. However, to find out what happens next, you're going to have to find the Sicilian Expedition Part 2. So that's it for this episode. We'll carry on with the Siege of Syracuse in the next episode. As always, thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful, informative and not too dull. Please leave a comment in the comment section below, and until next time, goodbye.